What do you think of when you think of human cannibalism? Sensational media headlines come to mind. Remote communities of people in a far off jungle, maybe. But what about Europeans in the Middle Ages drinking mummy dust? Or present day moms eating their placenta? My next guest is a PhD zoologist, emeritus professor of biology at Long Island University, and a research associate at the American Museum of Natural History. He's also the author of Cannibalism, A Perfectly Natural History, which explores cannibalism practices in human and non-human nature. Today, he's going to discuss the history of human cannibalism, what makes it taboo, and its lesser discussed psychosocial aspects, passion for the natural world, curiosity for the human one, author, zoologist, and proud Italian Dr. Bill Schutt. Thanks for making time today.
Oh, you're welcome. It's really nice to be here. Italian-American, that is.
Italian-American, yes. I loved all those references in your book that referred to that. That really made me feel connected to you. And I finished the book over the weekend. I have to say, it has like my kind of entertainment, history, zoology, and enough snarkiness to really make it like my brand of education.
And all of my Aunt Roses are there as well.
Fabulous. I feel so close to Aunt Rose now. I also recognize the immense amount of research that went into every aspect of it. So I'd love to kick things off by asking you what surprised you the most about everything that you researched in preparation for writing the book.
I guess I could break that down into really two things. And one of them is human related and the other has to do with the animal kingdom. As far as the animal kingdom goes, up until relatively recently, when people thought about cannibalism in the animal kingdom, they thought about praying mantises or maybe black widow spiders. And it was only over the last 20, 25 years or so that scientists began to realize that cannibalism was a whole lot more frequent across the entire animal kingdom for reasons that had nothing to do with the reasons that they thought animals cannibalized each other, except for these weirdos, the mantises and the black widows. Cannibalism in the animal kingdom was sort of blamed on cramped conditions or starvation and captivity. But they began to realize that things like parental care and a lifeboat strategy where the two eggs of a bird hatch before the third egg. And when the third egg hatches, it's a little guy. And if there's no food, they'll either boot him out of the nest or eat him. And as a hedge against environmental conditions that might be changing, it's also a reproductive strategy for many animals. And so that was a big surprise. As far as humans go, once I had learned all about the fact that cannibalism was arguably the greatest taboo that humans could come up with, the fact that medicinal cannibalism was so widespread across Europe for hundreds of years, right up until the beginning of the 20th century, that blew me away, given the taboo aspect, given the knee-jerk reaction that we have, when you say the word cannibalism. I did not expect, especially in the West, where this taboo sort of originated. I didn't really expect that to happen.
That surprised me a lot too. And it surprised me that the level of exaggeration that happened with colonizers labeling people. I think in your book, you said, quote, candidates for extermination or slavery, and especially in regard to Christopher Columbus and the Dominican Republic. I was vaguely aware that they use that as an excuse to kill people and, just wipe out whole groups of individuals. Can you talk more about that? Because I think that's something that the listeners would also be surprised to hear about, specifically Columbus and the DR.
I really talked a lot about it because it got to me, it was so interesting once I sort of fell into this topic that Columbus, for example, on his first voyage to the New World in 1492, the people that he met, he pretty much characterized them as gentle and nice and ready to become good Christians. And he was really looking for gold. And when he didn't find gold in his later visits to these islands, things changed. And without gold, you had to look for something else to finance these trips. And human beings became the resource. So these groups that were initially designated as being, nice and gentle and friendly, all of a sudden they were being labeled as cannibals. Now, in 1503, Queen Isabella had sort of decreed that if the indigenous people that Columbus met were not cannibals, then they needed to be treated well. And if they were cannibals, then you could really do anything you wanted to them. So what a coincidence. Once gold didn't turn up, everybody became a cannibal. And so that meant that these were not humans, and you could kill them and rape them and steal from them and take over their lands and enslave them. And this became the sort of modus operandi of a lot of flag planters that came to the, quote, new world, unquote.
Yeah, those good old flag planters. It just, I imagine, I mean, this is my imagination only, right? Because I'm not a researcher or a zoologist. I'm just me. But I imagine that these cannibalism tales would also give these adventurers a certain amount of status as great storytellers and people who were brave in the face of savages. And then when you have that thought, which, is conjectured, albeit, but you compare it to our current indoctrination over decades of envisioning brown people in a far off place as savage and in the Stone Age, it kind of brings up the question internally, at least, like, okay, well, how do we undo
Huh.
all those years of indoctrination when, it doesn't even seem that we'll have access to a complete history because it was written by the flag planters?
Sure. I don't know if there's a full answer to that question, but just the other day, when I went to the Museum of Natural History, I went with my wife and we walked around a couple of places that we hadn't been to that recently. And what they had done, and this is over the last year, is that they had taken some of the older displays. So the one that pops into my mind is sort of pilgrims meeting indigenous men. And they were coming into this village and they were handing over wampum. Now, this had recently been revised with signs that indicated that, nowadays we don't really think that this was valid. We don't think that these guys would have been as undressed as they are. There's a lack of women in this scene. So we're trying, and a lot of people are trying to sort of remedy the problems that were so systemic for so long. And we've got a long way to go. But the removal, for example, of the Roosevelt statue out in front of the Museum of Natural History, that's a case in point. And that one depicted Roosevelt sitting up on a horse, and beside him is an indigenous American and an African. And so they are clearly subservient. Now, this statue was up there for 90 years, and there wasn't that much of a big deal made over it. But over the last couple of years, there were demonstrations, and red paint was thrown on this statue, and eventually it was removed. So I think that there is an effort out there to sort of bring the truth to the forefront. And that's really one of the things that I wanted to do when I wrote that section about how the term cannibalism, which we have this knee-jerk reaction to, was used as a bludgeon to dehumanize and as a way to sort of give a green light to all sorts of horrible behavior.
That horrible behavior was not pointed back at the Europeans. That's what
Absolutely.
is so funny.
Because you weren't dealing with humans, you were dealing with cannibals who were monsters. Just another set of monsters that the explorers met up with. And there were all sorts of descriptions of creatures and weird animals. So when the early anthropologists started to get to places like, for example, South America and Africa, they expected to find cannibals. And so there was a lot more cannibalism reported in this early anthropological writings than we believe actually occurred, because they went in there with a mindset that these groups were going to be cannibalistic, whether they were or not. Some probably were for reasons that varied. Culture is king. And if you didn't get the memo that you're supposed to bury your dead, then you might come up with a belief system based on the fact that you consume your loved ones after they pass away, or warriors that you might slay in a battle.
Yeah, I wasn't surprised about the eating the flesh of your defeated enemies, which is kind of telling of my personality. So warning to anybody who might cross me, I suppose. But the funerary rites was surprising. Was that a common way for people to find closure of their deceased loved ones?
Yeah, I don't know if it was common, but but once it was, then it becomes sensationalized and popular. And I use a couple of examples. When anthropologists went into central Brazil, they found this indigenous group called the Waray, and the Waray consumed their dead. But the Waray were just as freaked out by the fact that, of course, I'm paraphrasing, they asked them, what did you guys do with your dead? And the response was, well, we buried them. And, the Waray were sort of boring down about that. What do you mean you bury your dead? Why would you put them in the ground to be eaten with worms? Why wouldn't you incorporate them into your cells? So this is that whole idea that culture is king. And it's, we as humans determine what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And a lot of times that has to do with food. Back in the old days, groups were sort of characterized or pointed at and made fun of because of what they ate. Chinese are certainly a group that comes to mind. And the French went, they used to be called frogs because they ate frogs' legs. And that was, people thought that was weird. So when you put together the greatest taboo and add food to that, then you've got this fascination that you see with the subject of cannibalism.
Well, I mean, let's talk about, what is it called? Transubstantiation. So in your opinion, does the Catholic belief that bread and wine actually turn into the body and blood of Christ when consumed in communion exist under the umbrella of cannibalism, and we don't think of it as such simply because culture is king?
I think now I've got a lot of Catholic relatives, and all of them is sort of like, yeah, we're eating the actual body of Christ, nod, nod, wink, wink.
Right.
And I got in trouble for that line from somebody from the Vatican contacted me, and they were like, you're misinterpreting this. And I didn't quite understand how it was, but in the old days, the Catholic belief was that the bread actually turned into the flesh of Christ and the wine turned into his blood. And it was not nod, nod, wink, wink. And you could get into real trouble if you were accused of things like stealing the host or doing something nefarious with it. This was a way to persecute groups like Jews and others. So there are certainly gray areas. It's not black and white. If you chew your fingernails and swallow them, is that cannibalism? Or if you're swapping spit with somebody, is that cannibalism?
Well, I enjoy not only the controversy, of course, but I enjoy I don't know what the word is, I really like when you have concepts that in our mind exist in a certain framework. And then, like as an experiment, a thought experiment, you flip it on its head and then you ask the same question
Yeah.
and get a different answer. So on that, I would love to have you share more about what you mentioned at the very beginning, Europeans and as I mentioned in the intro, people eating, mummy smoothies. I know they weren't really smoothies, but I just found it so interesting. Can you talk about that? Because that's another example of cannibalism that doesn't seem to make the history books, and yet the cultures of indigenous people in far off lands do.
Yeah, it pretty much got erased from the record. It was very, very commonplace throughout the Middle Ages. This is mostly in Europe, right up into the early 20th century when the Merck Index listed this material called mumia. And mumia was ground up mummy. And this is just one example of the fact that not only did we eat just about every part of the human body consumed to cure, fill in the blank, but extremes like, we believe this came from a mistranslation of an Arabic word for tar or bitumen, which we think the ancient Egyptians used to bind wounds and things like that for some medicinal purposes. But eventually when it got translated, it was the same word as the Arabic word for mummy. And when the Europeans ran into that, they mistook mummy, the dried up dead guys, for what was being talked about as medicinal. And so this, in a sense, a cottage industry began with sending mummies over from Egypt that were ground up into a powder that was taken in you'd make it into an elixir to do things like treat upset stomachs or epilepsy. And then when they ran out of mummies, they started to produce their own mummies, exhume dead bodies and prep them and then dry them out. And as I said, this continued right into the 20th century. The Merck Index is this pharmacological catalog in a sense. And mumia was right there up until about 1905 or so.
That's crazy. When you think
Yeah, and
about
then
it.
all of this disappeared. All of the record of this disappeared until some authors and researchers started to dig this stuff out and write about it over the last 20, 30 years.
So interesting. And the line of medicinal cannibalism is eating one's own placenta. I really enjoyed that you brought this aspect into your book because as I was researching, exploring really my own curiosity months ago in this area, I remembered that Sometimes mothers do this for medicinal purposes to curb, postpartum depression or energy loss. Can you talk about your own experience with the woman in Texas? And that I found that really interesting.
Yeah, this is sort of the last vestige that I can see, or pretty much the last vestige of medicinal cannibalism. And it's not done by many people. I thought it was more widespread, and it certainly wasn't. But it is a form of alternative medicine. And the thought here is that when the placenta is delivered during childbirth, and all of a sudden it goes from this miracle organ to afterbirth, and almost instantaneously, usually it's disposed of. But some people came up with, and we think this is probably in the 1960s, the lack of a placenta and the hormones that it produced would produce the things like mood swings, the baby blues. So the thought became, well, if you consume the placenta, then you can replenish those hormones. And so doulas and other people started to specialize in dealing with a clientele who was interested in having their own placentas prepared in a number of ways. So I was just about done with this book, and I had written that chapter already. And a placenta specialist who was a researcher, probably the only one up at Buffalo, gave me the name of a woman who did this for a living in Texas. And so I thought, okay, well, let me interview her over the phone and see if we can get some neat stuff to just put in here at the end. And as we talked, she was really interesting and really intelligent and funny and nice. And I thought the conversation was sort of ending. And she said, well, it's too bad you can't come down here because you could eat my placenta. And I just went, what? Did I just hear this woman tell me that I could fly down to Texas and eat her placenta? And she said, yeah, I just gave birth, and my placenta's in the freezer. And my husband is a chef. He can prepare it any way you want. He can make it into a taco. He can prepare it asabuco, whatever you want to do. And I just, I sat there and I thought to myself, I'm writing this book about cannibalism, and it's like 10 years down the road. And if I had the opportunity to consume part of this woman's placenta and I didn't do it, I figured I'd be kicking myself in the behind. So as my wife describes it, within 10 minutes, I had tickets to go fly down to Plano, Texas, met her. And if you read it in the book, it's, I also write fiction. And if I made this up as a fiction writer, it couldn't have gotten any weirder or more interesting or more lovely. The people down there I fell in love with them. Her and her husband and her 10 homeschooled children. After I got there, they were swarming all over me, and they were, can I touch your iPhone? And are you eating mommy's placenta? And I was like starting to freak out from all these kids hanging all over me. Long story short, that they prepared it. He had put on his chef's outfit, sauteed up some vegetables. I had gone to a liquor store, and I tried to find the most Texas-looking person I could find. And I said, I've got a kind of an interesting pairing for tonight's dinner. Then the woman wound up running away from me when I explained to her what we were doing. So I found a nice bottle of red, and he actually used that in preparing these vegetables. And I get the question, what did it taste like? It's going to taste like, it depends, if this is an organ meat, it's going to taste like, and to me, it was a little bit like the consistency of liver. The taste was sort of like, reminded me of, back when I was in college, I used to eat chicken livers and fry them up. And it sort of reminded me of that. But it was, to me, no big deal. I didn't eat a lot of it. Would I do it again? No. I think that I don't condone it. I think that diseases can be transmitted by the consumption of placentas, especially if they're mishandled. So, I did it because I was writing a book about cannibalism. It was not something that I think works. She even admitted it herself. I really got the feeling that she believed that it was the placebo effect. Because if you think of a hormone as a protein, if you cook it, you are denaturing that protein. Like when you cook an egg, that albumin goes from liquid to solid. It doesn't have the same properties anymore. By the same token, these hormones are being denatured as you cook them. So I do think that it was a lot of the placebo effect. But it was a remarkable trip. I'm really glad I did it. And I sort of topped the book off with this chapter, Placenta Helper.
It really did put a nice bookend on all of the information that your book offered. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I also respect, the yes factor of it, like the overcoming your own ew and replacing that with, I think there's I think there's some power in that. Do you think that the ick and anger factor in us is innate, or do you think it's more culturally developed?
I think it's culturally developed. And I searched for, is this knee-jerk reaction to cannibalism? It's something that is like biologically ingrained in us. And I really came to the conclusion that it's not, that it is culture related. And there were cultures where you wouldn't think twice about some things that other cultures would just think is, the most disgusting thing that you can do. That's part of the niche that I was lucky enough to fit into with my books. My first book was about blood and blood feeding creatures, Dark Banquet. And the second one was cannibalism. And the third one was a little bit different. It's the one that's out now is Pump, A Natural History of the Heart. But I love to go in and look at topics related to those big, sort of the title topics, and give them a slant that demystifies them and, topics that people generally would freak out over, and put a zoological slant on them, and then look at the history behind why we think this way. I was really lucky because I've been able to, over the course of what's now going on 4 books, writing a book about the natural history of teeth, that thread winds through everything that I do. And I find it really interesting to take that approach, take something that people, freak out over, and just put it in a different light so that there's a different understanding when you get done with the book, and to do it in an entertaining and humorous way. It's sometimes difficult to write humor when you're writing about cannibals. And so you got to sort of pick your spots, but it's doable. And I've had a lot of fun taking that approach. Plus the fact that I'm not an expert in any of these things. I studied bats for a living for 30 years. And here I am looking at women who prepare placentas for their clients. It's really stimulating. And I'm incredibly lucky to be able to write that sort of thing.
It's stimulating and it's important. My listeners right now are probably smiling ear to ear as they heard you describe the thread of curiosity that goes throughout your research in your books, because they know that that's the thread that goes throughout my podcast episodes, because the idea for this is to lead with curiosity instead of judgment. Ask questions, even if you're not sure they can ever be answered. I call it disrupting the algorithm, because the algorithm, fits into a headline and we're fed it in a regurgitated fashion, right? It's like the same headline reworked and rearranged. And so by having a more active version of curiosity, it allows us to explore these topics, which are incredibly entertaining and equally enlightening. And so I'm so glad that you came today and that we had this conversation. I'm really grateful. Thank you. Before we sign off, though, can you tell people where they can get your books?
Pretty much anywhere that books are sold. So Amazon to any bookstore, you can order it if it's not there. I've got a Goodreads page and an Amazon authors page, and my website is billschutt.com, BILLSCHUTT. I'm pretty easy to reach, and if readers have questions, I'm always really happy to get back to them about things.
Perfect. Thank you again.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening. If you've loved a couple episodes of the show, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. Having recent reviews lets others know that the show is worth tuning into. Just share where you're listening from and why you liked a certain episode. If you're listening on Spotify, you can't leave a written review, but you can leave a rating, and that is equally appreciated. If you liked this episode, you'll also like the one with the man who ate his own foot after losing it in a motorcycle accident. That's episode 327. Stay tuned next week when I talk with an author and professor about the shady and sacred sides of the funeral industry. Until then, keep it curious.